Hi, my name is Paige Dine, and I am conducting this presentation as part of Use and Users, which is a iSchool at the Illinois Information Science class 503 with Dr. Nicole Cooke. We were asked to look at an information world's population and describe the information-seeking behavior and needs of that population in and outside the context of the library. As an aspiring science librarian, I decided to look at academic scientists and their research practices. But first, before we start talking about the research process of these academic scientists, we have to understand who they are. So who are the academic scientists? They are the researchers, the postdocs, the professors, and faculty, usually in higher education, at an institution with the Carnegie classification of R1 or R2. They can also be found conducting research in liberal arts colleges and other comprehensive universities. These are the people who are teaching students and publishing cutting-edge research. And what impedes that research process as part of their role? Starting in the lower left, we have their funding. These researchers have to require their funding from somewhere within national grants, their own institution, or how to run their labs. This money can come from grants, it can come from scholarships, and it can come from other funding agencies, like the National Science Foundation. Next, they also have to balance other tenure track or tenure responsibilities, such as teaching and service. Research is maybe not always the first priority. At a liberal arts college, for example, a lot of these academic scientists are required to teach first and conduct their research second. Next is a deluge of scientific literature. As we move toward electronic literature being the most popular way that people like to access PDFs and scholarly articles, preprints, and conference proceedings, we notice that there's been a large deluge of scientific literature because the process of science is iterative. There is a lot published on it all the time. And this deluge of scientific literature and the interdisciplinarity of science has kind of become this funnel of a lot. So the key challenge that the scientists face here is that they may not have effective searching processes in order to look at all of the literature. They're a biologist. They have to look at chemistry. They have to look at physics to understand the interdisciplinarity of their field. And so scientists don't actually really love the idea of having to admit that they're not the most effective searchers. In addition, they're also trying to manage their own personal electronic and print collections, as well as use the library collections and services. So there can be some miscommunication and overlap, or how these scientists obtain their sources. If we think about research being a mixture of inputs and outputs, however, in their research process, Falciani-White said we could break this down into three key categories or inputs. So these inputs mean that they're anything added to a research project. They're the actual work that goes into the output, which is the research. So any combination of these factors will depend partly on the researcher, but also on their social, environmental, and information-seeking behaviors. Social behaviors include collaboration and networking with other professionals, teaching, what they say at the front of the classroom, and their communication both in person or electronic. Environmental inputs can be consistent of physical location. So where is their lab located? Is it close to the library? Is it close to other colleagues? Is it even on campus? The next question that really impacts research can be organizational culture. That goes back to, what is the focus of the university? Are people being pressured to publish? Are researchers being asked to do more teaching versus research? What's the balance there, and how does that affect their research processes? Also, the next, of course, is funding. Funding is the backbone of science research, and science research cannot be done without funding. We can't make something from nothing. So that's also an environmental input. Where is that money coming from? And then lastly, we have the input of information seeking, which is the actual time in which an academic scientist is aware that they are information seeking. They are looking for information through reading, skimming, browsing, or even attending conferences. So why does this matter? Well, if you see here on the right, once you add a scientist as a stir stick and stir it all up, a mix of whatever their social, environmental, and information-seeking inputs creates a various different types of outputs. And these things in the field include things like articles, books, new research, conference presentations, and even continued research as research outputs. But why does this matter? Well, for us as librarians, it matters because we didn't have a model for faculty research practices that talked about inputs and outputs and how they reflect and work iteratively with one another. You'll see here on the left we have our inputs, and we also on the right have our outputs. And it's connected by this arrow that says gleaning. The idea here is that scientists are social creatures who are around in a community of practice and socialize with one another in their environments, but also outside of their environments when they're giving their outputs. So for example, on the left we see a social input, so networking with colleagues to create a presentation. They then go and make that presentation as an output, and they disseminate that information at a social event like a conference. At the end of the presentation, they're engaging in a social input again of talking with somebody who may have followed up with a question, and then they can continue to use that conversation that they made at the conference and that connection with someone in their information-seeking behavior. This is what we need to focus on as information professionals moving forward in trying to help academic scientists. We need to understand their iterative social, environment, and information-seeking behaviors as inputs and how that affects their social dissemination and organizational outputs. Instead, we're focusing largely on those information-seeking behaviors and how those information-seeking behaviors are defined. We can see this through Ellis's model of information-seeking behavior established in the 1980s. Now, here I've listed them in a logical order, but Ellis is very conscious of the fact that researchers can have different approaches to their research process. So starting are activities that actually start the research. Those, if we compared them to our information-seeking inputs, would be the moment of when somebody realizes that they have started their research. So the actual act of reading, searching, and browsing. Next we have chaining, which is popular for academic scientists. They can chain through several sources, forward or backward, in order to see how science has progressed or where it is progressing. Then there's browsing, which is semi-directed. And I like to think of this as scientists completing what Bates calls berry picking. So moving from one source to another based on whether or not it looks relevant to the topic, if it's a compatible format that they're interested in, just browsing to see if anything piques their interest. The next is differentiating, which uses differences between sources as a filter of the nature and the quality of the material. In the research that I conducted, scientists preferred electronic and web sources more over print sources. But they can use web browsers like Google Scholar to find different types of sources, preprints, articles, and web articles. A scientist may use differentiating in order to determine the credibility of a particular source. Monitoring means that you're maintaining the awareness of developments in a field. As we talked about the deluge of scientific literature and the interdisciplinarity of scientific literature, monitoring is getting harder and harder for people to keep up their own personal collections, their library collections, as well as just on the topic itself. And then lastly, extracting is working through a particular source to locate material of interest. Scientists are commonly writing their papers in articles in the IMRAD format. That is IMRAD, which stands for Introductions, Methods, Results, and Discussion. Scientists know that they can look at these separate sections within an article and read what they need to in order to understand it. So for example, if I'm a scientist and I start out my research, I know that I want to browse Google Scholar in the web. I may run across an article and in Google Scholar that's scholarly, but I may also run across a web article. At this time, I have to differentiate and do some investigation into who these authors are and what the source material is, and that's through differentiation. Then, this process is all happening because I know I need to monitor and keep up with the literature, but I also know that I am going to chain through these sources and try and look at all of their method sections in order to see how I can improve my method in the future. So when we think of this Ellis's model of information-seeking behavior, I also want to encourage people to think about academic scientists belonging to a community of practice, and that is the scientific community, which is not new by any means. Kuhn talked about the scientific community in 1960s, but LaVey came up in 1988, came up with this idea of communities of practice and 3 distinct factors that affect whether or not a person belongs to a community of practice. So first, the members understand the community's collective purpose. In science, that's pursuing the objective truth or nature of a theory or a question. They also have to engage mutually through continual communication, which we see through the social inputs of networking, collaboration with other colleagues, etc. And they also have to have a shared repertoire or collective knowledge. Science is based solely on the fact that collective knowledge helps us advance. Failures and successes are treated not equally, but they are equally important to the profession as we work through theories and experimentation. So what does this look like when we think about the scientific community of practice? Practically, it looks like, oh, here we have an increase in scientific literature being published online and electronically, and there is a decrease in the use of print journals because electronic is preferred. So instead of going to the library and engaging with a librarian who the academic scientists see outside of their community of practice, they will rely on sharing articles to access or jump paywalls with their colleagues. Another way that we can look at how the scientific community practices is we can look at the scientific method itself. It's the iterative process of asking a question, reading the literature, designing and conducting experiments, recording and analyzing data, and sharing, discussing, or presenting those findings. Now, of course, as we saw with Ellis's model of information-seeking behavior, and as well as Falciani-White's model with inputs and outputs, these things are iterative and happen over time. You may ask a question or an observation, and then share and discuss findings with a colleague before going to analyze some data through reading the literature. So what does this mean as a community in respect to libraries? Academic scientists love to learn from each other and collaborate with another, and they do keep personal electronic and print libraries. They engage with other community members in research endeavors as collaboration makes science stronger in that shared repertoire and collective knowledge and mutual engagement through communication. They also visit the library for more technical skills like making photocopies, and they may not visit the library to browse the print collection as they do prefer electronic over print. Academic scientists will not start with the library. They'll start with their colleagues and the effective searching behaviors that they perceive to be effective when they're looking in the deluge of scientific literature. They won't use ILL to obtain all articles because they do not see the library as part of their community of practice. So they will not engage with librarians to try and find information. They will ask their colleagues, their graduate researchers, etc. They're not going to visit the library to browse print collections. But they won't also know the library's services either if they never go to the library. So, what does that mean? What do we do as future librarians? Well, this means that we have to acknowledge that there's a research life cycle going on with scientists and academic scientists. We have to understand their faculty inputs and outputs and understand and facilitate the idea of gleaning, this iterative research process that moves between input and output. We also need to learn to speak the language of their community of practice. What are their research methods? Offer the solutions. Give them an article ahead of time. Know that they're not going to just start with experimentation first. We also need to know their pressures, funding, access. Are they teaching or researching first? And we also need to make our services known. If we can keep up with the scientific literature for them or show them how to subscribe to a table of content in a journal, by advertising our services in this way rather than in the traditional ways of signage, we can be successful with helping academic scientists in their research. We can also go straight to the source and go to the department or the administration before we rely on advertising only in the library. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.